My name is Colin Damute. I'm the Director of Marketing with mLevel. And this month we are hosting our own founder and CEO, Jordan Fladell, and featuring microlearning and gamification expert, Karl Kapp. Just a reminder that everyone is on mute and we will be answering questions that were submitted previously if time permits. We will send out a link via email of the recorded webinar as well as a PDF of the slides and a brief survey. So we would really appreciate your participation on the survey so we can better provide targeted content in the future. And as a part of our continuing webinar series in the next few months, we will be featuring Home Depot's Brandon Carson, author of Learning in the Age of Immediacy, as well as the author of Star Conspiracy's enterprise learning buyer, Roberta Gogos. And now let me turn the controls over to Jordan Fladell, who will introduce Karl Kapp.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you everyone for taking time today to attend our first webinar. We're looking forward to a great series of these in the future. I think everyone on this call has had a chance to learn a little about Karl, but Karl is one of the leading experts in gamification, if not the expert in gamification and microlearning. He's an excellent professor at Bloomsburg University, and it's exciting to have Karl. Thank you so much for having you join us today. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's fantastic being here. Thank you so much. And let me start sharing my screen here.
Awesome.
And can everybody see the slides here?
It looks great, Karl.
Okay, awesome.
And
so that's the three of us.
That's awesome, and we'll get some technical support people for those, or we'll have our team go back in. So, Karl, I thought today would be great if we got started. You know, I know people can't see us but hear us, but I'd love to maybe anchor us in the beginning with a brief definition for what is gamification. I mean, you've had a chance to, obviously be part of an emerging trend here, and I think it'd be great to anchor everybody in what really gamification is all about.
Right. So, yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a good one because there's a lot of confusion around gamification. So basically, to me, gamification is the use of game elements in traditionally non-game settings. So, for example, that might be the use of providing some levels as somebody levels up as they gain more information. It might be a form of a badge where somebody may earn a badge for learning some information. It's also, though, a little bit broader. Sometimes I view gamification as a continuum because sometimes gamification is adding a little bit of playfulness or a little bit of game thinking or even a game to the whole journey of instruction. So if we look at learning not as an event, but as an unfolding occurrence of information to try to make people better, smarter, faster, those types of things, gamification really is the whole concept or idea of thinking about using game and game elements to ultimately get to the learning outcome that we want. So one of the other things that I'll say about gamification is, a few years ago, game was a 4-letter word in organizations, and we added ification to it, and all of a sudden people were like, "Oh yeah, we can go with that. It sounds, scientific." Although games for learning have been around forever and have been really impactful forever. But I think gamification is kind of an umbrella under which we can encompass a lot of highly engaging, highly interactive activities that keeps the learners focused on the area that we want them to be focused on. So that's rather a long definition, but I really think it's important to think of it kind of as a gestalt, as kind of an overarching umbrella of using lots of techniques to engage and motivate learners.
Karl, thank you for that. I have a great follow-up question to that, and I just want to progress. I want to let Richard know that, yes, we all see the same barber on a regular basis. So,
Thanks, Richard.
Richard, we're glad to share the name of the barber. It's a standard clipper, $12 a cut. No issues for you there.
Right.
But Karl, follow up on that. So to me, gamification is, it seems to have similar traits to those things in the consumer loyalty program space. And it's quite frankly used for consumers in the areas of weight loss, fitness, and it's been around for years. So why all of a sudden now is the craze in L&D and in human capital management as gamification started taking off? Besides, we've added a few other letters to the word game and gotten to go.
Right. Yeah, I think there's actually a couple of things that really add to it. And so one of the major, I'm going to click ahead. So one of the things that's really started to come into forefront, although this is fascinating to me because it's been around since like the 1800s, is a thing called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And so that's really research that shows that the longer we're away from content, the more we forget about the content. It makes perfect sense. And so the technology was never available until now, until recently, to add intervention. So if we look, I'm going to go one more at another version of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. We can see when we first learn something, we know 100% of it. And then over time, we forget some. But if we get a little bit of a reminder of that information, we engage with that information a little bit, it takes us back up and to full learning of the content. And then again, over time, we forget it. But if we keep doing that, we can actually bring up the amount of knowledge and the longer we've learned it. So what has happened with cell phones, mobile devices, and ubiquitous Wi-Fi is that we now have the ability. So it didn't make sense, 10 years ago to fly everybody in for 5 minutes of instruction, fly them all home, and fly them in the next week. But now that we have apps, phones, and Wi-Fi, we can take a very quick look at information, remind ourselves of what we need to know, and go on from there. And we can do it and what gamification adds, because I tell the story. My son was studying for the SAT, and I said to Nick, Nick, let me help you study for the SAT. I know a little bit, something about learning. And he's like, okay, Dad, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, I want you to spend like 10 minutes a day studying an SAT word. And he said, Dad, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm not doing that. I said, Nick, you're going to do well in the SAT. Nah, Dad, you don't know what you're talking about. So like a week later, Nick comes home and goes, Dad, look at this really cool thing. It's this little game I play, and it gives me an SAT word. And if I do this, I get points. And if I do, they get bad. So what gamification does is add that motivation to do what you should be doing anyway, and you should be doing it. You should be refreshing yourself. You should be looking at the data, but you don't want to do it because it's not fun or it's not playful or it's not interesting. But gamification combined with this spaced practice and the spaced retrieval of information helps bring the content to the forefront. So that's a long answer, but the real reason why this is possible now is because of the technology.
Yeah, Karl, thank you for that. It's a great explanation. It makes a lot of sense as it ties into, again, like I mentioned, it ties into that legacy history on loyalty, getting people associated with their brand in the travel industry, and so like we've seen in the weight loss and fitness space. Karl,
right.
It's often demystifying. We spend a lot of time talking to clients, and they talk about gamification, but then very quickly we get into this concept of game-based learning, and I think one of the key things is people struggle to understand the difference between the two, gamification and game-based learning. What's your kind of point of view on both game on the difference between game-based learning and gamification?
Right. I think that's a good question. So really what gamification allows you to do is to take content that the learner needs to learn and present it to them in a way that's interesting and motivating. So you take elements of games like points, like leaderboards, you take badging, you take levels, you take progress, and you provide that in an environment where it's very game-like, but it's not actual game itself. The difference between that is that's using pieces of games. So you might have points, but you might not have anything else. Well, you can't just play a game with points. You need story, or you need levels, or so then gamification maybe adds points and badges, but doesn't have the whole game space that you play in, and the content remains pretty much like you would learn. You would see a video, or you would see some content or answer some multiple choice questions. That's gamification. A game is where you actually take content and manipulate that content to make that content into a challenge, and then to make it actually into a game space where you would pretty much stop everything else that you're doing and engage in that game, and usually for quite some period of time. The other thing I think is interesting to me, games often as opposed to gamification, often have an element of fantasy in them. So, you're trying to get off an island, or you're trying to find the treasure, or you're trying to, do whatever you happen to do in Assassin's Creed. You're running around knocking off people. It's all kind of fantasy. In gamification, it kind of is a closer mix, I think, to what you're happening to be doing in the job. You get a question that you have to think through. You get the question right. You get some points. You get a bunch of those questions right, and you have some displayed knowledge in a subject area. You get a badge. So I think those elements of gamification, where we take elements from games and kind of sprinkle them into content, can be a really powerful tool. Where a game's really good for, and here's another distinction. I think gamification is really good for declarative knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge. I think a game itself is really good for, if it's designed correctly, can be really good for softer skills like negotiation skills, leadership skills, problem-solving skills. So that's another way you can kind of segment the two.
Awesome. Well, you kind of answered both questions for me at the same time, so that's great. I think this is interesting because Jennifer just asked a question that we'll answer directly later in the chat session. But what I was focusing on there. So now we've got gamification, we've got game-based learning. Do you think that drives different outcomes with learners who are coming through programs that are gamified or using games versus traditional learning tools, such as maybe an e-learning course that requires them to sit and just watch a video or watch an e-learning program roll out, or maybe in an instructor-led session? I mean, again, I know you did a ton of research and you go across the globe and see so many different programs. So I'm wondering, from your perspective and what you've seen, does it really drive different outcomes?
Yeah, so let me answer that question by showing kind of a case. So the short answer is yes, it does. And it does that in a couple of different ways. But let me just talk about one way and one study that I think will bring this to light. So there was a control group in India of men between 35 and 55, and they were glucose intolerant. So they were very susceptible to type 2 diabetes. And they assigned two different groups randomly. One group, they got the traditional intervention about what you should eat, what you should do. So it was stand-up classroom-led instruction. The second group, though, got a series of behaviorally oriented reminders, basically, sent to their cell phone twice a day. So you'd get a behavioral reminder like bike to work instead of drive, or don't eat while you're watching TV because you'll overeat. And at the end of 2 years, they looked at the one group that got the traditional classroom instruction on what to do, what to not to do for diabetes, and the group that got these messages sent out over time. And they found out that the group that got the messages over time reduced the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes by 36%. And that's a completely behavioral disease. Well, not completely, but highly controllable through behavior. So the answer is yes, we can actually nudge people toward a certain outcome that we want, much more directed, much more focused than we could in kind of a classroom where we're trying to cover everything in 8 hours. The other thing we know from gamification and providing a little bit of information, let me just find this real quick, is that, of course I can't find it, is that if you get a lot of information at once, you can get information overload. Oh, here it is. You get information overload. And if information overload causes you to fatigue on the information. So if you get gamification, we're getting these little chunks of information, the micro-learning, you avoid two inherent problems with this thing called mass practice, which is cramming, which is the hours and hours of classroom instruction. You avoid learner fatigue. They can get the information very quickly. They digest it, understand it, and you also reduce the likelihood of interference with preceding and succeeding information. So if you're just going to have this one element for a couple minutes a day, learn it and move on, or be reminded of a behavior and move on, then you're much more likely to retain it, to use it, and apply it over time than if you get a ton of information in the classroom and you have to sort it all out, and this information's interfering with this information. So yes, the fact of the matter is gamification provides and microlearning provide really targeted learning nuggets that are retainable and much more actionable than classroom instruction.
Karl, that's great to hear, and obviously, we also believe that there's driving outcomes and lots of different reasons and impacts for that. About today's modern learner and the fact we're all distracted. But you brought up a topic in there that I think other people on this call would really love to know a definition around. You talked about this concept called microlearning, and so you introduced the term, and I always like to make sure that our listeners understand a term because maybe it's new to them or maybe they've heard lots of different definitions. So could you expand a little bit about what microlearning is and give us a good definition so we can anchor ourselves as we move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, lots of different definitions, but two of the ones that I like are one from Donald Taylor over in the UK. And he says that microlearning is learning from content that's accessed in short bursts. So I think it's really important. It's a short amount of information, maybe less than 5 minutes, and it's relevant to the individual at that point in time. So you want to know something very quickly, you go in, you look at it, and then you can do this over and over again so you can build retention and conceptual understanding. And the thing about this is, I get a little bit of information today, and maybe 2 days later I get a little information. There's a little bit of overlap in that information because that helps me retain and recall the information a little bit more effectively. John Eads, president of LearnLoft, says that really it's teaching and delivering content to learners in small, specific bursts. And typically, I think that microlearning is one objective per learning event. And that's kind of, I think, how that works out. So those are kind of my thoughts on microlearning. It's a small burst of information focused on one learning objective provided to the learner over time.
Yeah, and I think that thank you for that, Karl. So I think, as we look at this, we have games, we have gamification, we have microlearning. It's really all this motivation to get the learner to engage and give them the information in the way they kind of want to receive in these bite-sized chunks to avoid learner fatigue, to keep them highly motivated, and to reward them for that behavior and get that action. Ralph, we do see your question. We'll definitely get to it later. But as we continue to talk about microlearning, right, it's in my house, right, I have the privilege of having 2 young teenagers in my house, and I often joke that my teenagers do homework while being distracted in a way I never understood as a child. And so I'm kind of curious, is there a particular type of learning that resonates with your audience that's from a microlearning type of content that maybe audiences that are listeners would focus that's better in microlearning delivery or better into bite-sized chunks than other types of content, or is it universally applied? Does one content size fit all? Is it like one of those hats you buy in the store that no matter whether you have a big head or a small head, it seems to fit no matter what?
Right. Yeah. I've never seen one of those hats. I mean,
well, clearly,
I've seen them available, but they never.
I don't need hats. We have just shiny bald heads.
Right. Exactly. But they never quite fit. So I don't think so. For example, the one example I give is, when Sully Sullenberger landed that jet in the middle of the Hudson, he did not land that based on a series of micro-learning gamified events, right? He had rich experience flying gliders. He had rich experience in flight simulators. He had really in-depth, what I would call macro learning. So there's definitely, micro learning might be, I need help now. I need it short. I need declarative knowledge, which is anything that I can memorize. So if I'm in pharmaceutical, I want to know mechanism of action. If I'm in sales, I want to know the features and functionality of a product. Conceptual information, what's the concept behind this particular product, or what's the concept behind my need for compliance and safety and that kind of stuff. So declarative and conceptual information work really well with micro-learning. And it's based on kind of asking a question. I need to do this. How do I do this? What is this? It works really well with video and text, and it's very good to be indexed and searchable. And the content is rated for, what do I need? Does this let me do what I need to do? Or does this give me the ability to recall this content when I need it? Those are some qualifications of whether or not it's good micro-learning. And then what you want to know is it accurate? And videos, articles, games, code samples, job aids, all that are really good for micro-learning. On the other hand, we still do need this macro-learning. We can't learn, as I said, everything with micro-learning. In most organizations, we need to know a lot of declarative and conceptual knowledge. But We also want people to problem solve. We want people to have interpersonal skills, and we can remind people what the interpersonal skills are and the steps to problem solving. But if we really want them to take a deep dive, I think that's actually where games work really well. Here's a game where you need to solve this problem, or here's a game where you need to negotiate with somebody. So that works a little bit better than gamification. Macro learning works really well if we guide the content, by a instructor who's had deep knowledge and can answer nuanced questions. And so ethics training, for example, I think is really an interesting thing if we want to get into nuances or gray areas. If we want people to talk to, that works really well as well. If we want coaching, mentoring, so all those things I think are what I call macro learning and allow you to really consume the content at a level where you're trying to connect these dots that it's not always obvious to connect. But again, in many organizations that I've been involved with, one of the huge obstacles are, what are the concepts? What do the terms mean? What are the elements of this particular item I want to sell? How do I position it? All those are really good for micro learning. So I don't think we should, throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. I think we need both. An intelligent application of both types of learning is what's going to make for the most robust and ultimately profitable organization who can apply learning when it's needed to solve problems, answer questions, and address the client needs.
Right. So, Karl, if I were to summarize that in what I call in the layman terms version of that, if I'm getting on a plane, I don't want my pilot to have been trained necessarily and how to operate and fly the plane via micro learning techniques, or been gamified to do it, or my surgeon to do that. But if I needed to anchor them in terms and knowledge, I might start with that micro learning experience for them, or gamified learning experience, and move them upstream to more immersive macro learning tools, combining both best practices to get me the outcome I want with that learning audience, right? I'm creating that motivation. I'm transferring knowledge to anchor them into essentially the base knowledge, and then I'm turning over to that immersive experience. Because obviously Sully, you're right, Sully used his glider experience and all types of different things to make that plane land. And I certainly hope when my surgeon opens me up for any surgery, I'm not the first time that they've exposed themselves to seeing a potential organ that they need to fix, right? So,
right, exactly.
Well, that's great. There's lots of great questions coming in on that end, and I think I'll try and tie in Jennifer's question around motivated learners to the next question I have, which is, we talked about types of content, right? We've talked about gamification. We've talked about gamified learning. And we've talked about it at macro level use cases, but, we have people here from the higher education field on, we have people here who have corporate learning struggles, and I hear this often. Is there a demographic that really, doesn't do well in gamified or micro learning experiences versus a, demographic that kind of thrives into these experiences?
Yeah, I found people like 110 years old and older don't do so well.
Goodness, it's a limited set of people who reach 110. They
right, exactly.
Yogurt and whatnot to get a long way to make it there. So
exactly. Or that one guy that like smoked and drank. Somehow he made it to 100. But so I think it's a little bit more not necessarily age, but what you're used to, what you're comfortable with, and what your corporate culture will accept. So, lots of people, who are, my age, who are old, and they play all kinds of games. They might not play, Assassin's Creed. They might play Candy Crush. They might play Words with Friends. They might play those types of games, Bejeweled. So they might be quick, small games, which actually, ironically, is used more in gamification than a game like, Assassin's Creed or Call of Duty or something like that. But what I found almost universally is it's the attitude of, and it's fascinating to me because mostly like managers are the ones that don't want gamification, right? They're like, oh, our people will never go for gamification. Don't put gamification in there. That's not a good thing. But then when you talk to the people that actually have to learn it, they're like, oh my goodness, this is great. I love gamification. It's breaking up the content. It's giving me a little bit fun when I go through the day. So I kind of like that. So I think it's really how you position it. Now, younger people have played lots more games, so they are a little bit more familiar with how the games work on average. And they're a little bit more comfortable with how the games work on average. but it doesn't mean that other people won't pick up the games or don't want to be involved with the games or enjoy the games or anything like that. So I think it's really a bit of a it's not universally fair to pigeonhole people by age into, yeah, they'll like gamification, yeah, they won't like gamification. I think really the bigger picture is we need to look at how our culture supports this type of learning, how we're socializing it, how we're helping people understand why it's beneficial, what it's doing for them, and what the results will be. And that kind of makes it a little bit more acceptable, across the board.
Right. I think, but I hear a lot of what you're saying there. It's not that there's a demographic necessarily that is, or an age bracket that is having challenges or not built to embrace gamification or embrace games or embrace micro learning. It's more about the positioning of it and the acceptance of the value proposition that audience understands. And I think there's another, we've had the opportunity to work with doctors before, and doctors tend to have a large bias towards, and if they spent years in school, right? I mean, most doctors have spent, 8, 12 years getting their degree and getting the right to become our physicians and become our surgeons. And, when presented traditional content and learning, they've learned in a very traditional way with some levels of application inside the classroom. So getting them to do something differently may be a challenge, but if you give them a good background story of what the value is to them, you have a better chance of success than if you just show up and say, here's this game we built to teach you new codes to show up and put in the system, right? Because that's not going to necessarily resonate with them as a learning style that makes sense to them or has the same value, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think it's much more how you position it than the age of the people you're positioning it to.
Well, I've taken up a lot of time with my questions and answers, and so Karl, I mean, at this point, maybe if we haven't covered a few slides and points, it might make sense to bring our audience in. They really came here to hear you speak more than me ask you a series of questions. So we'll put these questions that are coming in the queue in order. But if, Karl, there's things you'd love to cover, I'll turn the floor over for you, and now you can take us through a few more slides that you definitely had on your hit list to share with folks.
Great, excellent. So yeah, I one of the things that I really wanted to talk about is let me get it here, is the concept of why people are looking at their smartphones and why it's so important. So, for example, it's fascinating to me that the average person checks their smartphone about 9 times an hour, and they give content about less than 7 seconds to decide whether or not it should get their attention. So if you're not engaging them in 7 seconds, you're probably losing them. Now at work, maybe you get, 3 more seconds because it's a work-related thing or something like that. But again, if we're going to gamify content or provide content to somebody over time, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that gets their attention. And the average person uses about 2 devices per day. So we need to be cross-device because they're using these devices. And the other interesting thing is that 70% of people use their smartphone to learn. So I thought that was really kind of a fascinating statistic. And 67% of people learn on mobile devices. So learning and using mobile devices is something that people are interested in and doing, especially from a micro-learning perspective. And where are they learning? Well, this is kind of interesting to me. 27% are doing it on their work commute. So I used a car to represent that, but in second thought, I should have used a train or a bus. I'm hoping they're not driving and learning at the same time.
Karl, there's a new Apple feature that turns off the ability to do that called Do Not Disturb, right? So that just is not happening anymore. So it's only happening on trains and buses.
Very good. Yeah, so I need to change that graphic. 47% of people are learning on weekends, 42% at work, 52% at the point of need. So when you need to do something, that's where micro-learning comes in really handy. I had to change out the faucet on my shower, right? So I went to YouTube, found the right video, well, almost the right video. You never find exactly. There's always some part in your shower or whatever that doesn't quite match what's on YouTube. But basically, it gave me enough steps to do that. And then 30%, when they're notified of an update. And if you look at organizational use of microlearning, this is a report by ATD done in 2017 about microlearning, that 38% of all organizations are currently using it, and 41% are planning on using it within the next 12 months. So if we think that's almost 79, probably 80% of organizations will be using microlearning within the next 12 months, because you get really good results and you're able to reinforce knowledge and shape behavior as you go on. And so the benefit really is this small concentrated information, short bursts, you can deliver it anywhere, less learning interference, a really narrow focus on the topic. You can personalize it because you get just what you need, and you get it, as I said before, at the point of need. And microlearning then in organizations is being used as a refresher, right? So you go to a webinar, you go to classroom instruction, and then afterwards you get these pull-throughs to remind you. You know, we talked about the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, so you get these reminders so you don't forget, so the information stays with you. It's also used for providing new information or advanced learning to people. So we send out messages so people can see what they need to know, or learn this new information in increments instead of the old fire hose approach that we used to train people. And finally, enhancement. So you're in the middle of a job or in the middle of doing something, and that's when this micro learning shows up. And you can say, oh, yeah, let me how to do this real quickly. So that's kind of the shower example. So organizations are finding really interesting ways to add gamified micro learning to their toolkit. You know, as we talked about earlier, it's not the only answer, but it's certainly an answer. If you're just going to teach somebody, I always say, you know, if you're going to teach them definitions, concepts, and models, that's not the best use of classroom instruction. It's very expensive to get people together in the classroom. So when we get them in a classroom, let's use the things where there's subtlety and nuances and really need for rich discussion to figure out and learn generatively instead of other methodologies. So that's where classroom instruction comes in. And there's a couple mistakes to avoid as well. What I see, Jordan, often is this thing I call it shrunken head learning. So somebody takes an e-learning module that was in one of the authoring tools, and the authoring tools now have players, so you can play it on their phone. And so you just shrink down this e-learning course to fit on a phone, and you call that micro-learning. To me, that's not micro-learning. You don't take a course and shrink it, and voila, have micro-learning. It's a really painful process to go through. It should be designed for micro-learning and gamification from the beginning, not bolted on later on. The learner is really good at psyching out, yeah, this is kind of bolted on, and this is an afterthought. Same thing with chopping up. So somebody says, well, that's great, Karl. I'll just take an hour and a half e-learning course, and every 5 minutes we'll just chop it, and then we'll serve it chopped. Well, that doesn't work either, because you lose the context. You lose some of the integration that was already there. Integrated. So now you need to design it and say, look, they might not get the next piece of this. So I got to make sure this piece stands on its own. And this piece, they need to know like what context it comes in, because I can't guarantee they're going to have the context beforehand. So it really is not as simple as chopping up longer courses and making them into simple concepts. And then don't make the topic too broad. You know, you're using micro-learning, you're teaching very narrow, focused content. You're not boiling the ocean in 1 2-minute micro-learning segment, right? You're not teaching every aspect of the history of the earth. You really have to narrow down and say, okay, this is exactly what we're going to teach. And then finally, I think, and this is really important, and missed a lot, you need an overall strategy of how you're going to implement the micro-learning sequence. So you tend not to micro-learn on one thing. You're going to have lots of things to learn, right? And if you want that to be formal, because it's so funny, people say to me, oh, Karl, you know, micro-learning, gamification is informal. It's not informal. It's a formal process. You're actually want to have some control as an organization about what behavior you're helping to change and you're helping to bring to light. And gamification and microlearning combined do that, but it has to be focused and thought out. It can't be an afterthought. So an example of this is a project that we're working on with mLevel called I Look Out for Child Abuse. And it's a project out of Penn State. And it's to me, it's a fascinating project, because what we've done initially is created basically a 20-minute video, interactive video, about a caseworker who's confronted with possible child abuse. And this is mandated reporting. So the child care provider has to report incidences of child abuse. So you can imagine in some cases it's underreported when there should be a suspected case. In other cases, it's overreported. It's not really child abuse. Somebody just kind of overreacts. And the system has all kinds of noise in it, but it's required, so you have to do it. And then you only have the training once a year. So by the end of the year, you may forget what signs to look for or whatever. So we actually have taken this 20-minute video and mapped out a strategy of microlearning throughout, in this case, 3 years. And a woman named Sarah Dorr did this, brilliantly put this together. But let me kind of walk you through this, because if you're thinking about microlearning, here's a really good way to think about it and map it back to your learning objectives. So in the first part of this table, we have learning objective and learning modules. So we have learning objective 1, understand and recognize possible child abuse. Learning objective 1.4, know signs and symptoms. And what learning modules are they in? Learning module 8 and learning module 24. And then we actually take a look at what micro-learning chunk are we focused on for this learning module. So here, bruises that are huge, bruises on somebody that doesn't walk yet is a huge red flag for any child. And we can see what content is in the learning model, and then we can see then we can see what's actually in the script, what we actually say in the script. Then we see the quiz questions. So we've tied the questioning, the assessment, all the way back to the learning objective. And then when we do the pinging or the micro learning, we can see, look, we're going to send out a basic ping as what can cause a child to sustain a bruise, and the learner has to answer that question. This is months after they had the original training, so we're reinforcing that. Then we're asking them moderate questions. So now a learner drags and drops shapes onto a toddler to show where would you be concerned if you saw a bruise. And finally, we go to a website explaining Mongolian spots, which are often incorrectly identified as bruising. And then we finally say, how are we going to send that out as a vignette, as a web resource, as a matching game? So if you're thinking about implementing microlearning and you really want to have learning outcomes, this is a really good template to think about your strategy for unveiling microlearning. So again, you don't want to do it haphazardly. And to me, this is nothing informal about this process, right? It's a very formalized process because we want very formalized outcomes. So I think this can be a really good way to think about a strategy for creating microlearning.
Awesome. Well, Karl, that's awesome. We have a lot of great questions coming in from the audience. So I'm gonna ask if there's a few more things you want to cover, and then we can go digest. And I want to personally thank you for getting us involved in this program with the team that was Sarah and Benji in an effort to help people recognize child abuse and recognize potential challenges for learners. And I think for us, it's also been quite enlightening to see how someone in a very immersive learning space has found a way to incorporate microlearning and gamification into a program to drive participation from an audience of daycare professionals who have an unbelievable challenge on them to be regulated in this area. So again, thank you for that. And if there's no other slides, I'll let us go to Q&A here, and I'll kind of serve as our guest host and come all the way to the top and bring these questions together. I encourage your audience to start doing that. I'm going to jump on in, and Jennifer asks us, do already highly motivated learners tend to dislike gamification? I think it's a great question, right? We have a highly motivated learner, someone who's eager as soon as the new learning modules delivered comes out. How do they feel about gamification? You have any point of view on that, Karl?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there's a huge body of research out there that says that's fascinating to me. It says, if people are already intrinsically motivated to learn something, then giving them a reward or an incentive or something like that to learn the knowledge can actually be, over time, demotivating. And one of the really fascinating things about that body of knowledge is the instrument people use to measure intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. By definition, the way they created the instrument to measure the research was that you could not indicate that you were intrinsically and extrinsically motivated at the same time. You had to say you were one or the other. But the reality is people are often intrinsically and extrinsically motivated at the same time. So for example, if I wanted to go get my master's degree, I might want that degree because I want a raise. That's extrinsic motivation. But I also might really enjoy the learning process, socializing with others, talking to other people, all that stuff. That's internal motivation. So the reality is, in an organization, we're often both intrinsically and extrinsically motivated. And because of that dual motivation, it doesn't demotivate people because they're motivated by one or the other. So in the research that I've seen and the experiments that I've conducted in organizations, I have not seen a drop off of people who are already motivated to do the same thing. They just seem to be able to work with it and saying, yeah, I mean, worked with one organization and the research showed that people were engaged with the gamified platform for over 3 years. And if you look at all the research on intrinsic and extrinsic, that should not be the case. But it is the case because at work, you're dealing with information that is both intrinsically motivating and somewhat mundane and boring. And so the combination of the both actually keeps the learner engaged for that level of knowledge.
Awesome. So our next question comes from Ralph. He's a first-time caller, but a long-time listener to the event here. And
well, thanks, Ralph.
Ralph wants to know, how do you see the rise of voice, analytical command technology, that's a mouthful there, changing games and learning? So I guess this is the impact of things like Siri, Cortana, all these voice capabilities that are now naturally embedded into what we do on a daily basis. How does that really impact the changing of games and learning overall? It's probably a big question. Lots of thoughts there for you.
Yeah, it is a big question, but it's really kind of interesting because if you think about most of the confines of games, especially branching, if you think of branching games, you see a branching simulation, you see 3 choices, you say to yourself, I wouldn't say any of those, but you have to pick one. But now if we mix something like Alexa or Google Home in with a little bit of both artificial intelligence and machine learning, we can now carry on that conversation. So if we program a character inside of a game and allow them speech to text or speech recognition, then we can actually go in a lot of different directions. The AI will look for keywords and based on those keywords take us in a certain direction. Now, if anyone's used Alexa or Siri or whatever, you know it's not perfect. It can take you in some really strange directions. And some of it is what some people have called fake AI, which, here's a list of possible choices. And so the AI just picks from those choices. It doesn't generate spontaneously those choices. So while we're closer than we've ever been, we still have a way to go. It's kind of like when you build a house, right? It's 89% done, but that last 2% takes like a month and a half to 3 months because it's just not getting done. So we're close, but we're not quite there. So I think it will be a huge impact when that gets done. And imagine that combined with like augmented reality. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think it's very nascent. And I think eventually it will be a high impact, but I think we're like 10 to 12 years out for something like that.
Yeah, and I think the impact with those who are disabled and hearing challenge and sight challenge may be also there as well. So there was another question which asked, is micro learning or macro learning? Let me go pull the exact question up from Katie. Do people retain more from micro or macro learning? And I think, Karl, just my view, retention comes from practice and repetition as much as anything else. So I'm not sure it has. My point of view is that micro learning may be easier to get practice and repetition from, but macro learning done over and over again will still drive that same result, right? Again, for retention purposes, and again, you see it all the time, so I'd love to get your view on that as well.
Right. So, so what happens when we memorize something or work something into our memory is that we create neural pathways to that knowledge. So there's some belief that everything we've ever learned is in our brain somewhere. We just can't get it out, right? Because we don't have enough neural pathways to get there. We don't know which neural pathway to follow. And so it gets lost in our brain. But every time we go back to that knowledge, so that's that spaced practice or spaced retrieval, we wear down that neural pathway a little bit more. And as you keep doing that, you get more and more flow to that knowledge that happens to be in your brain. So whether you're doing it a little bit over time, whether you're doing it through deep learning or macro learning, but you're doing the macro thing over and over again, that can work. People just in modern organizations just don't have that time. Although I think there's going to be I predict in the future, 5-6 years, there'll be a huge market for, all day immersive seminars. It's kind of a backlash to this because our industry loves to be a pendulum. We like to go in one direction all the way and then in the other direction all the way. But anyway, and the truth really is in the middle. So if I was designing a learning program in any organization, I would design a combination of both micro-learning elements, gamification elements, as well as traditional instruction, hybrid webinars, and e-learning. And think of learning as more of an ecosystem than an event, and use these tools to create that rich ecosystem of learning, or blended learning, as Jody pointed out.
Awesome. So I'm going to take a quick break here, Karl, and introduce a poll. Why don't you get a sip of water? So I'm about to release a poll here.
Okay, sure.
And our question is, how many people are currently using gamification? I just opened the poll. If you don't mind, while Karl takes a sip of water and I queue up the next question, I will go ahead and get that going. So I see the polls coming in. That's great. Now if I go back to my chat, that'd be awesome. So Karl, hopefully you got that sip of water. We got a great question here from Peter Talmers, who actually probably will likely be a guest in one of our upcoming series here. Peter's an expert in the space with the firm Sloan Consulting. And Peter asks, can Karl talk more about what he means about generative learning? Is that in contrast to another type of learning, e.g. consumptive learning?
Yeah, so generative learning is basically where the learner actually generates the learning on their own. So they come to their own conclusion or their own ability to predict what's going to happen, their own work product, their own asset, et cetera. So they're actually taking the pieces that we give them and creating something a little bit new or entirely out of whole cloth from their own creation of that learning, as opposed to, like, if I wanted you to learn a definition of something, that's more consumptive learning. Like, here's a definition, I want you to learn it, I want you to give it back to me. I don't want you to add anything to it. I don't want you to embellish it. I don't want you to make it different, because we all have to have the same definition of the acronym. So we don't need to change it. But in terms of leadership styles, in terms of negotiation skills, in terms of how we approach problems, we all want to be able to provide a different methodology sometimes of doing that. And so that's generative learning.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. Thank you. So we've got a couple more questions here. We've got a great statement here for Richard. I would love everyone to jump on in. And Richard Hahn put a great thought about what the future might look like in a microlearning LMS. So Carla asked a great question related to higher ed. We're going to transition. I know this is a place that's dear and near to your heart because I've had a chance to connect with your students. Do you have any thoughts on how higher ed could use this type of approach when the course is over to help students recall the information?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of things. But first, let me just say hi, hey, Anders, and everybody take a look at Anders' comment, because he's done a lot more with AI and voice recognition than I have. So thanks, Anders. In terms of higher education, yes, I think that, you think about, I just read a really fascinating study the other day that said students who go outside of their own study group actually tend to do better in school. So they stay with their study group, but then they go outside and seek different information or reinforcement of information, et cetera. And I think if you think about a classroom, most classes are an hour, 50 minutes, or maybe longer. My classes are 3 hours long. And there's a lot of opportunity to forget what the content is. And there's a lot of opportunity over 15 weeks not to have that information reinforced. And we do a ton of cramming in higher ed, right? We have a midterm, so we cram for the midterm. We have a final, so we cram for the final. But we all know that cramming for a final is great for the final, but 3 days later, we don't remember anything. So if we use tools and techniques like microlearning and gamification, we're able to spread out that knowledge and reinforce that knowledge, create more neural pathways, and can be very beneficial to a learner. And I think, graduation, I think, should not be the end of a learning experience. I think it should be the start of a learning journey. And I would love it if colleges and universities would allow me to subscribe to the content that I enjoyed in college or that I found valuable and take that with me. So wouldn't it be great? Like, I graduate, let's say, with an English major, then 3 months from now or 2 months from now or whatever, I get a little note as a micro learning note. Maybe it's gamified about a novel that I wrote that I read in college, and then suggest that I read another novel and give me some questions about that novel. So wouldn't that be great to extend the learning that way? That's what I think can be really, really valuable, and really a good way of using kind of micro-learning gamification to break down the four walls of the classroom. And Carlo talks about e-learning. Same thing. I think, e-learning can be a chunk of information. We do that, but are we gonna know that hour and a half of content 2 days later, 5 days later, 10 days later? Wouldn't it be helpful just to get a little bit reminder what that content was, to make that neural pathway a little bit more easy to access?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Carl. I'm going to do one more poll here real quickly, everybody. Our next question to release, we're polling on is, how many people here are currently using micro-learning? We're going to go ahead and open that poll up. Now, we're all through our questions. There's a lot of great responses in our chat feed, and so I think we've addressed the majority of the questions. I would say that, the common theme here, and the thing that I keep hearing, you talk about, Carl, I see coming in from our audience that's joined the webinar, is the concept of what I'll call blended learning experiences, right? And this really, to me, and Carl, I'm glad to hear your point of view of this, is that we tend to be this all or nothing mentality, right? I think with the introduction of micro-learning, gamification, video, social learning, all the things that are now coming into the world that's differentiating the learning technology footprint, with the investment that's being made by many different venture funds and different organizations in advancing the learning space, it's kind of beholden upon us to have a blended learning philosophy. Like, it's not going to be like that magical hat that you still can't find, Carl. It's still not going to be a one-size-fits-all model, and there is no silver bullet in learning, right? Because if you were to go into a classroom, or you go in any organization today, you're going to see lots of different people in that organization. We have diverse backgrounds. We came from diverse experiences. We have diverse motivations, and we all have a thirst for diverse learning styles, which is why, you mentioned this ability of this learning occurring everywhere. And I think that's the mindset we need to take towards, our learning adventure, right? And I think that's kind of how, from my lens, sitting at my desk, I think about the world. It's not, what works for me won't necessarily work for Colin or work for Carl, except for the same barber in our case.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, there's lots of articles running around the field, like, is instructional design dead? Is this the end for instructional designers? Are we all becoming technologists? But the truth of the matter is, now more than ever, we need to be able to be architects of learning experiences and learning ecosystems. So our job now as designers of instruction is to say, look, for this type of learning, for this type of learner, here's the intervention we need. And then to move them along, we then need to add this. And then in order to make sure they've reached that outcome, we're going to assess like this. But for this other group of learners, we need to do this, we need to do this. So we actually need to be kind of the architects of figuring out how all these disparate pieces, which all do really good things, fit together to get the outcome that we want. And so I think it really behooves us to become really masters of what we're doing, so that we understand what instructional strategies work, when to apply what instructional strategies, to do the analysis that needs to be done. So the hard work, the analytical work, that kind of work is really now what we need to do. We need to design, there was some really rich research done years ago about, if you let a learner who doesn't know anything about a topic just explore wherever they want to go, their ability to learn something is highly diminished and not very efficient in terms of time and effort. But if you give them just a little bit of structure, if you give them too much structure, they don't like it and they turn off and they're non-motivated. But if you give them a little bit of structure, a little bit of roadmap, a little bit of pointers, they learn so much more efficiently and so much faster. And that's what we as designers of instruction, or some people use the term learning experience designers, whatever it happens to be, that's our role. That's our need. We need to understand how all these pieces fit together, because nobody else in the organization is looking at how all these pieces fit together except us. Like, no one else cares. And we need to care about that.
Well, that's awesome. Those are great closing words. So first, I want to thank you, Carl, for joining today's session. I really appreciate your insight. I'm sure the audience here does as well. I want to go ahead and take a moment for all that you have gone ahead and not know about Karl. Karl is an author in addition to being an expert professor, a consultant, and advisor in the space. So if you have a chance, go to Amazon and search for Play to Learn, and you can read all of some of these great insights that Karl provided us today in Play to Learn. And thank you again, Karl, for joining. Just to let everyone know, I thought this would be interesting to share from our quick polling. We had pretty good participation. About 69% of you are using microlearning currently today, and only 32% of you are not, so that's great to see. However, it's really interesting to see on gamification, only about 56% of you are engaging in gamification, where 44% of you are not. So I want to take a moment again to thank everybody for joining today. This will be a regular series, so please do make sure you pay attention to subscriptions. We'll have lots of experts like Karl joining us, and our goal with this whole series is to continue to provide you as our audience, both from a standpoint of our customers, our prospects, and those in the learning community, with experts like Karl to help you gather insight to do your job more effectively. Thanks again for joining. Thank you, Karl, for participating, and we look forward to seeing you next month.